If you've ever scrolled through the Turner Classic Movies listing and said to yourself, I've seen all these movies, I want to watch something different, then the Columbus Moving Picture Show is for you. Do you collect movie posters but feel hesitant about buying in online auctions without being able to see the item in person? Or about paying premiums that could significantly add to the price that you pay in the end? Then the Columbus Moving Picture Show is the place for you. Join a gathering that began more than 50 years ago with Cinevent and now continues with more to love. See film rarities in beautiful 16mm prints, including Flying Blind, starring Richard Arlen, about an independent airline company that experiences a hijacking during a brush fire. Or Close Harmony, an early musical about a band leader, played by Buddy Rogers, fighting with a theater manager, Harry Green, over the affections of singer Nancy Carroll. Or a dazzling Technicolor print of Kentucky from 1938, a film about a horse racing rivalry starring Loretta Young and Walter Brennan in an Oscar-winning role. Did we mention silence? See 2 silent film programs each day with a live piano accompaniment by either Dr. Philip Carley or David Drazen, including a trio of Buster Keaton shorts, Irene starring Colleen Moore with an introduction by Thomas J. Slater, who wrote the book on screenwriter June Mathis. The Little Americans starring Mary Pickford, introduced by Scott Eyman, who wrote a book on Pickford and one on director Cecil B. DeMille. And It's the Old Army Game, starring this year's Spotlight star, W.C. Fields, with an introduction by It Came from the Bottom Shelf's William Garver. There's nothing like laughing at the antics of great stars of yesteryear with a crowd of laughing people. As if the films weren't enough of a draw, you can also shop our expansive dealer space with more than 100 tables containing items like original movie posters and lobby cards, film stills, press books, 8mm and 16mm film, laser discs, DVDs and Blu-ray, books, records, kitsch, and more, featuring The Last Moving Picture Company, Movie Poster Exchange, Real Art, MPA Gallery, MPB Auction, Hollywood Canteen, The Paper Gallery, Doubting Thomas Books, Kitley's Crypt, Dr. Film, Thunderbean Animation, The Curator, and more. If you want to learn more about the films you're seeing, be sure to attend a few seminars where experts on a variety of topics will give presentations, including Laurel and Hardy expert Randy Skredvet, Margaret Hamilton biographer Don Billy, Alfalfa biographer James Turini, and Martin and Lewis expert Michael J. Hayde, among others. This year, LAMP, that's Learn About Movie Posters, will be on hand to identify your hard-to-identify stills. This membership service will be available to convention attendees absolutely free. Join us May 22nd through 25th, 2025, that's Memorial Day weekend, in Columbus, Ohio, at the Crowne Plaza North, where you can take advantage of our low convention rate and free parking. Tickets are on sale on our website, columbusmovingpictureshow.com. Have questions? Send us an email at columbusmovingpictureshow@gmail.com and keep in touch through Facebook, Instagram, and X.
I don't know why I picked Snow White. It's a thing I remembered as a kid. I saw Marguerite Clark in it in Kansas City one time when I was a newsboy. They had a big showing for all the newsboys, and I went and saw Snow White. It was probably one of my first big feature pictures I'd ever seen. That was back in 1916 or something, somewhere way back. But anyways, to me, I thought it was a perfect story. I had the sympathetic dwarfs and things, I had the prince and the girl, the romance, I had the heavy. I just thought it was the perfect story. Those are the words of Walt Disney when discussing why he chose to adapt Snow White for his first feature film. Before we get started, this episode is a tribute to and in memory of Maggie, one of the best dogs to ever exist. It's not often a dog with so much personality and character comes along, so we here at the Golden Silence podcast and our families consider ourselves insanely lucky to have spent 15 love-filled years with little Maggie. She was a special dog to be sure and will be incredibly missed. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fairy Tale Theater of the Golden Silent Films podcast, where you can trust us not to give you poison apples or smooches while you sleep. When it comes to literal pigtail hair, however, we make no promises. And according to our crack legal department, your continuing on with this episode relieves us of all liability in the event that you do, in fact, grow literal pigtail hair. And much like our last episode, we won't be taking this magical journey alone. Our guest chair will be filled once again, this time with the incredibly talented Leslie McMichael, who will share her thoughts on Snow White, harp playing, and so much more. Before we dive into the fairest of all fairy tales, let's talk about the various Golden Silent Films podcast social media outlets. As usual, head on over to Golden Silence Cast on Instagram for up-to-date info on this little podcast. And for all of you folks on X or Twitter, just follow at Golden Silence 1 or just search for Golden Silence Cast and we should pop up. Our newest social media hangout spot, as you are well aware I'm sure, is Bluesky, where you can find us at Golden Silence Cast. All of these screen names and sites will be in the episode description in case you are interested in checking us out. We would absolutely love to have you hi-ho-ing with us in the internet realm. At these social spaces, you'll get behind-the-scenes pics and info, upcoming episode reveals, and other fun film-related materials. And, of course, you're going to get photos of our magical podcats, Soda and Gizmo. Also, if you're listening to this program on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or Apple Music, please leave comments, reviews, ratings, or both, or all. I guess technically there's more than two. Our show has been around for 5 years, and we've only received 17 reviews on iTunes. We would love to see those numbers keep growing, and you awesome silent film fans out there can definitely make it happen. All of those ratings and reviews help so much. Live your best review-leaving life and help our show grow and reach the fellow silent film fans all over the world. Dropping those reviews gives us more exposure in the world of podcasts and lets us know how we can improve. As always, we are grateful for the feedback and always want to bring you the best show humanly possible. And please subscribe to the Golden Silence Films podcast. While our output can be sketchy and irregular, if you are subscribed, you will never miss an episode, and the moment new content drops, it will go straight to your listening device of choice. We are into our 5th season now and don't want you to miss a second of the action. And as for YouTube, we are pushing to get 100 subscribers before 2026, so you know the magic words. Like, comment, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. Now, whether you may have heard or not, there is a Disney live-action remake out right now of Snow White in the theaters just as this episode is being recorded and being released. Now, it's garnered quite a bit of controversy. Since it was announced, folks, mostly those on the internet, have been giving this film a hard time, and I couldn't agree more. This remake is incredibly controversial here at the home office of the Golden Silent Films podcast. The water cooler talk here has been nonstop. I truly mean it. This modern iteration has given into the modern culture in the worst possible way, and what we are left with is a film that is both outrageous and offensive. I know you fine listeners out there are thinking the exact same thing as us. How dare they make a Snow White with recorded dialogue? It's a travesty, a really terrible creative decision, catering to the lowest common sound-loving denominator. But let's calm ourselves a bit, take a step back, and go back to a simpler time when our fairy tales were silent. Let's go back to 1916 and discuss the second film adaptation of Snow White. This was a movie I never even knew existed. To me, the 1937 Disney iteration was the version of the Snow White mythos. Heck, I had completely forgotten there was a Huntsman until the release of the modern Chris Hemsworth Snow White and the Huntsman. So imagine my surprise when I was scrolling around YouTube and this version from the teens popped up. The film's thumbnail, a picture of the movie poster, really sold me, and I watched it right then and there. What a fun, magical surprise it turned out to be. The film was so fun, we decided it deserved an entire episode just to itself. Long-time listeners will know this is not our first experience with the silent Snow White. In fact, if you go back to our 19th episode, released during the second season, you can listen to our discussion about a 2012 film called Blancanieves, directed by Pablo Berger. This was an ingenious reimagining of the Snow White lore, set against the backdrop of Spanish bullfighting in the 1920s. It's a real gem for any lover of Snow White or silent film in general. It's a visual delight with an incredibly emotional story. As I mentioned earlier, we found this film on YouTube, so that will be where we watch and discuss it from. and I would be remiss if I didn't shout out the channel where it was first found for us. This movie exists on a number of channels on the streaming service, but I caught it for the first time on the Which Way YouTube channel. That's WITCHWAY, Which Way YouTube channel. This is a great landing spot for any enthusiast of witch-themed content in pop culture. From reviews of witch-specific television programs and movies to differences in their portrayals across different mediums, it's really a fascinating channel. It is really awesome stuff to be sure, and silent film fans who appreciate their films on the spookier side will also love this channel. If there is a witch-themed silent film, or even just witch-adjacent, it's probably available on Which Way for your enjoyment. And that was where we first found this great early iteration of Snow White. A great channel and totally worth a look and a subscribe. There are also a number of other channels strewn about the YouTube world where you can catch this film. They are all of pretty solid quality and clear picture and intertitles. Regardless of where you see this great movie, it just matters that you do see it. You can also see this film at the website of the National Film Preservation Foundation at www.filmpreservation.org. Here you will get to view a digital reproduction of a 35mm film version preserved at the George Eastman Museum. Another bonus for checking out the film here is that you get a load of behind-the-scenes info about the film. It's a really cool setup for those looking to take a deeper dive. No deep dive into a Snow White movie is complete without a look at the life and sleep of the titular apple-loving princess. We can trace this story back to the Grimm brothers back in late 1700s and the early 1800s Germany. According to Ken Monshine, Ph.D., in his foreword for an edition of the Grimm's Fairy Tales, writes, "Fairy tales are, after all, a form of folktale. They were works of low culture, very unlike the stories of valiant knights and holy saints that the rich paid poets to compose in the Middle Ages, or later literature that was judged by the sophistication of its references and allusions. For centuries, fairy tales were considered outside the bounds of refined taste." Now, those tales outside the bounds of refined taste came from the brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, who wrote a series of books collecting a series of oral stories, fairy tales, and folklore, which was then first published on December 20th, 1812. Volume 1 of the first edition contained 86 stories, which were followed by 70 more tales, numbered consecutively in the first edition, Volume 2 in 1815. By the 7th edition in 1857, the quantity of tales had expanded to 200 tales and 10 children's legends. It is considered a seminal work of Western children's literature and is listed by UNESCO in its Memory of the World Registry. These works include such classics as Rapunzel, Cinderella, Rumpelstiltskin, and my personal favorite, the story of the youth who went forth to learn what fear was. Now, what makes these tales so timeless, though, they aren't just stories recorded for future readers. I mean, they are to a certain extent, sure, but they are also works of art that capture the imaginations of both children and adults. Whether it's the relatable emotions, the story twists, or the dark, and no pun intended, grim situations, these tales have imprinted themselves on the very DNA of human culture. Adam Gidwitz, from literacyworldwide.org, writes, "The brothers Grimm had a peculiar combination of scholarly brilliance and artistic flair. Jacob, the older brother, was the taskmaster and the father figure. Wilhelm was the artist, though also a scholar in his own right. Together they cast a wide net, bringing in hundreds of stories and then choosing those they deemed the most typical of the German folk and the most satisfying for children and adults. Wilhelm in particular revised the stories that they heard, adding delicious and dark details and elevating the prose." That brings us to our magical story for this episode, Snow White. Now, if you'll notice, the original story was just called Snow White or Little Snow White, and it wouldn't be until the Broadway show in 1912 and the legendary Disney film in 1937 that the "And the Seven Dwarfs" would be added to the title. The tale of Snow White and her adventures with witches and dwarves and handsome princes was first published in 1812 by the Grimms in their first edition of their collection of Grimm's fairy tales, numbered as Tale 53. The original German title was Sneewittchen. The Grimms completed their final revision of the story in 1854, which can be found in the 1857 version of Grimm's Fairy Tales. Monshine wraps up the Grimm duo and their accomplishments thusly. From fairy tales to scholarly papers and dictionaries, the Grimm's contributions to German language and culture remains equaled by few and exceeded by none. As we work our way through the film's narrative, we will also be comparing the written version to the filmed version. Maybe see where things remain the same and where they kind of diverge a bit. Now, while fiction can be fun, let's talk about the real woman portraying the pretty, pretty princess. Helen Marguerite Clark was born in Cincinnati, Ohio on February 22, 1883. She was one of 3 kids, only to be orphaned at an early age. Marguerite Clark, looking back at her childhood, would explain, "I think I was the sort of child who lives in a dream world all her own. I believed in fairies until I was an almost impossible age, and in one way I believe in them still. With my mother and father both dead when I was 11, and with only a very dear elder sister to care for me, I knew the meaning of sorrow at a much earlier age than most girls do. These years, I had a real school life at a convent in my home state of Ohio. Yes, I'm a Middle Westerner. And then came the beginning of my professional career." Now, that professional career would really take off after one of Clark's performances got her on the greater entertainment radar. Clark, in an interview with Picturegoer magazine, tells the story of her discovery. Clark relates, "I suppose every girl who plays in amateur theatricals dreams of the night when the all-omnipotent manager from the great city will be a guest at the important function. One evening, the dream came true, and when I was acting in a little charity affair, I heard it whispered that Milton Aborn had seen and he had approved of my performance. And with Mr. Aborn, I made my first real stage appearance one night in Baltimore, Maryland." Now, to say she was successful on the stage is a bit of an understatement. She would jump from starring role to starring role. Now, here's a quick rundown, via photoplay, of a few of her popular productions. In 1902, she was engaged by DeWolf Hopper to play Polly in Mr. Pickwick, and in 1903 made her first pronounced personal success in Babes in Toyland at the Crystal Gardens. After that, she played with DeWolf Hopper again in Wang and in Happyland. Her favorite part is that of Peter Pan in the play by Barrie of that name, in which she toured the country. She was the original Zoe in Baby Mine, which was her first starring part and a tremendous success. As her career progressed, she played Shakespeare Jarvis in The Lights of London, and the title roles in Merely Mary Ann and Baby Doll, not to mention Snow White, The Affairs of Anatole, and Prunella, which firmly established her reputation as an artist and that of its producer, Winthrop Ames, as a master of beautiful stagecraft. Now, since this is a snow-centric episode, let's look at her stage version of Snow White. This story was adapted for the stage by the aforementioned Winthrop Ames, who closely presided over its production at his little theater in New York. He also personally selected his future Snow White. Clark loved the role and the production as it achieved a fair amount of success. All in all, she lit up stages across the United States from 1899 until 1914. But the world of entertainment was changing. With film going on the rise in the public consciousness, it was only a matter of time until the young actress took her talents to the moving picture. According to J.B. Kaufman, Marguerite Clark followed up her years on the stage by signing a contract with Adolph Zukor's Famous Players Film Company in 1914. In a profile from the April 1921 edition of England's Picturegoer magazine, we learn about her auspicious first role as Letty Roberts in 1914's Wildflower. The article reads, "Who of Marguerite Clark's many admirers does not remember her first venture upon the silver sheet? In this picture, an adaptation of the stage play Wildflower, she immediately reached the hearts of thousands of picturegoers, and with her fresh, blossoming loveliness, her impetuous, natural, and unspoiled girlishness, made a place for herself in the realms of Shadowland, which is still peculiarly and exclusively her own. If you're attending the Columbus Moving Picture Show in May, which you heard the ad to earlier in this episode, you will be able to see Marguerite Clark on the big screen. The Classic Film Convention will be screening her 1919 film, Miss Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch, where she starred as Lovey Mary. Now, her film career was basically full throttle out of the gate, as she starred in more than a dozen features over her first 2 years. She was a big-time star who often was compared to Mary Pickford, her Famous Players Lasky studio mate. They were two stars at the peak of their powers, leading to a bit of a rivalry in the eyes of theater-goers and the press, though it never really got too personal. As much cool stuff as she did in the film world, the magic of the stage was never far from her heart and mind. She talks very bluntly about this soft spot for the legitimate theater in an interview with Photoplay magazine. Clark says, Facts are tiresome and ridiculous to some. I know, but you know I am very matter of fact. Oh, quite matter of fact. I know I don't look it, but I am. I am working simply and solely to earn my bread and butter, and my ambition is to find a good play. Do you know of one? No? It's a pity. I shall remain in the pictures until I find one. You see how matter of fact I am? I confess that I really much prefer the stage to the pictures. I know that I'm not supposed to say so, but I do. After all, one loves to be able to talk. The actress continues saying, I know that pantomime is really a wonderful thing. There is a tremendous amount of art in it, but I confess that the stage and the lights and the people and the fine sonorous phrases written by a master for me to speak fittingly have a fascination I cannot forget. I will never be able to forget it, but one must live. I work in the pictures and I give the best I can. That is my duty to the people who come to see my work. On the personal side of things, Clark, at least in her public life, was never one to give up much information about her personal life. She believed in leaving a little mystery, a little bit to the imagination, if you will, and because of that, she was always playing coy about what went on behind closed doors. Even various publications went out of their way to mention how innocent she was and how single as well. On the topic of love, Clark, in a 1916 interview, once said, Personally, I have no desire to have my heart broken. I have always taken good care not to leave it around or lose it, and so far, it has never even been cracked. I think it is worth clinging to. Why, I should think one would be unable to work or think or anything when one is miserably broken-hearted. Now, the love bug would eventually bite Marguerite, and she would eventually, I imagine, experience the heartbreak she always feared and worried about. Those wedding bells rang out on August 15th, 1918 for Clark and New Orleans plantation owner and millionaire businessman, then a U.S. Army lieutenant, Harry Palmerston Williams. Before we get into that later life of the actress and the official movie talk, let's bring in another important person with a great connection to this particular film. That would be our special guest for the episode, the incredibly talented harpist, Leslie McMichael. Welcome to the Theater of the Gold and Silent Films podcast, Leslie.
Stuart, I just want to say it's just such a pleasure to have received this invitation and to have had this wonderful conversation about film and music and all things historic. I am definitely a fan of historic preservation, so all my passions are all wrapped up together when I do this kind of work. So I'm delighted that you have this marvelous podcast. It's going to be so fun to talk about things today.
It is an absolute pleasure to get to talk to you about music, silent movies, and this great adaptation of Snow White. But since this is a silent film podcast, let's start with some silent film chat. What is your history with silent film? How did you find it, or did it actually find you?
I think silent film found me. I was probably aware of silence growing up, but was definitely more of a fan of musicals. Certainly, The Wizard of Oz was an annual favorite back in the day when it was played on TV once a year. The Sound of Music, of course. And then when films like Star Wars came along, who couldn't have loved those amazing scores by John Williams? So I think silent film found me when a friend of mine who was a director of a children's film festival. She had the tradition of including a silent film every year. And the second year when she featured a silent film, she asked me if I would step up and write a new score for it. And that film was the amazing 1924 Peter Pan. And at that time, my friend, knew me as an active musician and as a movie lover, and it occurred to her that that it would be very natural for me to be able to play music for a film, and I accepted the challenge, but wasn't entirely sure how I was going to go about it. I'm a pretty capable improviser, but I realized pretty quickly that particular film, which, if memory serves, is 104 minutes long, I think. It's longer than some of the other films that I played. And I realized I didn't really want to improvise for the whole time. I wanted to write a fully notated score. And the opportunity to write new music for these old characters is just the most wonderful thing I've gotten to do as a musician. Because, as I'm sure you know, as I'm sure fans of silent films would agree, their faces are so expressive, and it just gives the musician-composer such a wonderful opportunity to illustrate the action and the emotions with music. So silent film found me when I was commissioned to write a new score for Peter Pan for the Children's Film Festival in Seattle, and I think that was back in 2007.
That is really super fascinating and super cool to hear. I love how unexpected your journey to silent film was, and it really shows how people's roads and journeys to silence are all so different. I had mentioned earlier that you play the harp. Tell us a little bit about your journey as a harpist.
I have played the harp for a very long time. I've played the harp since childhood, and I've gotten to the point where I no longer say how many years ago that was. But it is the joy of my life that I get to play an instrument that resonates, literally, with so many people. I do the standard kind of weddings and funerals sort of playing, here, there, and everywhere. But being able to write movie music, film music, has just been such a delightful area to expand into. Harp music and music, harp music is just so expressive and really able to illustrate so many different emotions, and certainly silent film is full of all the things from sweet to dramatic to evil to charming, and the harp, although is somewhat stereotyped in terms of angels and things like that, the harp is really capable of a lot of interesting sound effects, and a lot of...
Like you mentioned earlier, there are some stereotypes about harp playing and harp music. I'm living proof of that because my mind was blown when I read you played film scores on that harp. I mean, using a harp in that context was super outside the box to me. What brought your harp world and the silent film worlds together? How have all those silent classics affected your harp playing, if at all?
So the thing that brought my harp world and silent film together was an actual musical commission, as I mentioned, for Children's Film Festival Seattle. And since that time, I did receive other musical commissions from them, and also one from SIFF, the Seattle International Film Festival, when they did the Hitchcock 9, commissioning new scores for Alfred Hitchcock silent films. And the effect silent film has had on my harp playing, it's made me very confident in my ability to compose and play my own music. Sometimes the harp world likes to think of certain music as being harpistic and other music as not. For instance, when you play the harp, the strings ring, and you don't really want to come right back to a ringing string, because that's the main quality of harp music, is that it can ring and ring until you come back to stop the strings. But I have found in the course of coming up with new music to express silent film stories is that sometimes some percussive and repeated chords kind of music is just fine with some of the chase scenes that I've put together, and dramatic things like the sword fight in the Peter Pan score that I wrote. So just kind of shedding some of the perceived limitations and stereotypes, and freeing myself up to do all kinds of music on my instrument has been one of the effects that silent film has had on my harp playing. It's just such a joy to play live with the film, and have the music, have the ability to play music that changes as the characters are telling their stories and going through different emotions. Doing the timing really well is a great fun for me as a musician, which is why I very much love playing my live score shows. I've gotten to the point where I am pretty brazen about reaching out to different presenters and trying to find new places to present my work. I know the harp is not considered to be a traditional instrument for silent film accompaniment, but it's so joyful and fun and feeds my soul that I get to the point of practically cold calling people. There's a wonderful theater in the Boston area, the Somerville Theater, and the proprietor said it was a total cold call in a Boston Globe article that ran about our I think our Snow White show, and it's true. I will email a whole bunch of people and hopefully hear back and convince people of the wonders of vintage film and a live score performance. It just could not be more fun for me, and I think it's pretty great for the audience as well.
I love that can-do spirit. I mean, the magic of that cold call attitude is something we really both have in common. In fact, this interview is a result of a cold call, or more appropriately, a cold email. A little behind-the-scenes info for all of you fine listeners out there. In researching this film, I came across some articles written about Leslie and her playing alongside Snow White, and I thought, I need to learn more about her harp and her in general. So I took a page out of her book and messaged her out of the blue, and here we are chatting it up. And I must say, I think you would put on a heck of a show here during the Pittsburgh Silent Film Festival. And we at the podcast will definitely put our power, what little podcast power we have, on the case to bring you to the Steel City for a performance. Speaking of places to go for performing, where has your harp playing taken you?
I've had the chance to tour and play live score shows from coast to coast. There are definitely I would say more venues on the East Coast that are accustomed to including silent film with live music in their programming. So I do make a habit out of trying to travel to the East Coast a couple times a year just to find those audiences that already know a silent film and love it. I'm also very interested in letting people in sharing the experience of a live score show with new audience. I think my favorite places to play are historic theaters, single screen theaters that might be the centerpiece of arts in their towns, and I really appreciate the synchronicity of a vintage theater showing a vintage film. Maybe they played silent films or vaudeville back in the day, and now here we are. Everything is old is new again.
Now, I bet across all your travels and all your harp-related adventures, you've played in some pretty cool venues, right?
I've enjoyed playing at the Silent Film Museum in Niles, California, the wonderful S&A Silent Film Museum, where Charlie Chaplin once made films and Bronco Billy built a silent film studio. I've also played at a museum in the Fine Arts Museum in Houston and the Oklahoma City Museum, as well as some wonderful vintage movie theaters, such as the Somerville Theater in Somerville, Mass., the Coolidge Corner, also in Massachusetts. Sometimes I've had the wonderful occasion of someone discovering my work from my website online and calling or emailing me up and inviting me out to play as part of their series or at their theater. And when that happens, I of course accept with alacrity, and then often try to find nearby venues so that I can make a mini tour out of it, something before and maybe something after that anchor date. But very often, it's just me booking one date and then independently on my own, trying to find nearby venues that also might enjoy showing a live score vintage silent film.
That is also absolutely cool to hear. Now, as I mentioned, Pittsburgh has some top-tier film venues and film audiences that would be so incredibly lucky to hear your work live. I also love the concept of non-traditional instruments being used for silent film accompaniment. A couple episodes back, we discussed DJ Zombo and his Zombotron, which was incredibly unexpected. Live music of any sort is such a great addition to the movie-watching experience. But before we get into more harp-centric chat with Leslie, let's set the scene for the film we're about to watch. Going into this, I thought surely this would be the first of many fairy tale-based episodes. I mean, the earliest days of silent films are absolutely jam-packed and littered with literary inspiration. Just looking back at our past episodes, so many are based on novels or books or plays, so obviously, I figured Snow White was just the tip of the iceberg of fairy tale-inspired films. But surprisingly enough, this story seems to be the only one to have gotten a silent adaptation out of the famous Brothers Grimm. If we are wrong, which could totally be possible, do leave a comment and point us in the direction of more silently filmed fairy tales. It would be much appreciated. But in the meantime, let's focus on the magical tale at hand. Snow White is a god-tier A-list megawatt fairy tale. Everyone knows the story of a jealous stepmother, a poison apple, and true love's kiss, all that. It's been told for many years and in many ways, but where did this film's story really begin? The first adaptation on film came in 1902. It was produced by a Sigmund Lubin and released in the summer of 1902. Unfortunately, this film is considered lost, and I really struggled to find much info on it. Approximately 10 years after that initial adaptation, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs would make its Broadway debut at the aforementioned Little Theater on West 44th Street, New York City on October 31st, 1912. Based on the stories by the Brothers Grimm, it was produced by Winthrop Ames, who had written it under the pseudonym Jessie Bram White. This rendition would prove quite successful and garnered some pretty positive reviews. One of the reasons for its success was the charm and talent of Marguerite Clark, who starred as Snow White. According to J.B. Kaufman, in an article for silentfilm.org, we read, "The famous player Snow White is a descendant of several theatrical adaptations, each of which had taken increasing liberties with the particulars of the Grimm fairy tale. The film's most immediate ancestor was a stage version by American theatrical impresario Winthrop Ames, who had presented it on Broadway as a special children's attraction at his Little Theater in 1912. Ames had written the script himself under the pseudonym Jessie Bram White and had carefully supervised every detail of the presentation. His choice for the lead was Marguerite Clark, a 25-year-old actress under his management. Clark, already a 12-year Broadway veteran, had demonstrated that she could play a wide range of parts, and she readily took to the child-woman role of Snow White. "I have never enjoyed playing anything so much," she would tell the New York Times. This show was so well regarded it became the basis for the 1916 film we're about to talk about, and the performance of Clark was so on point that there was no one better suited to play the famously fair Princess Snow White. The stage production ran across 2 different theaters and 72 performances before eventually closing and paving the way for a Daniel Frohman presentation with Miss Marguerite Clark in Snow White, written by Winthrop Ames. Now you can tell in the way this film is made that it was written by a stage veteran. According to the National Film Preservation Foundation, we read, "The film version, also written by Ames, is true to its theatrical origins, with deep proscenium interior staging. This film was produced by Famous Players Film Company, Adolph Zukor President, distributed by Paramount Pictures Corporation, and directed by J. Searle Dawley and photographed by H. Lyman Brawning. Queen Branjamar is played by Dorothy G. Cumming. Prince Florimond, played by Creighton Hale, who you may remember from our previous episode, and Berthold the Huntsman, played by Lionel Brom. The Witch Hex was played by either Alice Washburn or May Robson. I found a little debate as to who physically took that role. and obviously Snow White is played here by Marguerite Clark. Now, the movie opens in one of the oddest ways possible. It was such a strange opening segment that I totally thought I accidentally clicked on the wrong video, or that it was some sort of incorrect video that was uploaded. The music started, and I was thinking to myself, this kind of sounds like Christmas music. Now, the craziest part of the whole thing was, I was right. We see Santa coming out of a chimney into a house before materializing a huge Christmas tree and a bunch of dolls as a child looks on from the steps. These dolls change from mere toys into humans who will be the characters in our upcoming Snow White spectacular. The figures all bow before the fairest of them all as we fade into the film properly. This Santa cameo must surely be because of the film's December 25th release date. A lot of people do an awful lot of arguing about the questionable Christmas bona fides that various non-Christmas movies have. The Golden Silent Films podcast has always been firm in its belief that Die Hard is not a Christmas movie, but I think after this opening segment we can all agree that Snow White is a legitimate Yuletide film. The film starts out by setting the scene and the world by telling us, once upon a time, a beautiful queen named Imogen, embroidering at an ebony frame, pricked her finger and shook the drop of blood on the snow outside her window. It looked so beautiful, the queen said, I wish I had a little daughter with skin white as snow, lips red as blood, and hair as black as my ebony frame. Maria Tatar, author of The Fairest of Them All, Snow White and 21 Tales of Mothers and Daughters, writes, the red, white, and black color coding in many European versions of the story reminds me of how the Grimms believed that those were the colors of poetry. Their beautiful girl is white as snow, red as blood, and black as the wood on this window frame. It was Disney who changed that to lips as red as the rose, hair black as ebony, and skin white as snow. When you look at other versions of the story, you realize that, generally, the daughter's skin color is not an issue. Tatar, the John L. Loeb Research Professor of Folklore and Mythology in Germanic Languages and Literatures and a senior fellow in Harvard Society of Fellows, continues, the fact that the beautiful girl in a global repertoire of stories about mothers and daughters is stereotyped as having skin white as snow because of the influence of the Grimm and Disney versions limits the global cultural resonance of the story. There's nothing sacred about the Grimm's version of that fairy tale or about Disney's reimagining of it, but we tend to think of Grimm and Disney as the originals, and unfortunately, they have become the authoritative versions. Soon after that wish was made by the queen, a baby daughter was born with, you guessed it, skin white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. She was then named Snow White. She was the fairest in the land, but Branjamar, an evil lady of the court, conspired with a witch to surpass Snow White's beauty. In return, the witch demanded that, in the future, she would receive the heart of Snow White. We see this conspiring happening either in the woods or a cave of some sort. This was a little difficult for me to fully decide on. Either way, there is a cauldron and huge toadstools. In attendance is the less than attractive Branjamar, the aforementioned witch, and an anthropomorphic cat. A very, very good example of a proto-furry, if you will. The witch gives the potion to Branjamar, who drinks it up and becomes instantly gorgeous. The witch gives Branjamar a mirror, telling her, this magic mirror will always answer you truthfully. But there's a catch. There's always a catch. The witch adds, if you ever break that mirror, you will become as ugly as you really are. The witch had a lot going on here, and by a lot, I mean a lot of expository dialogue. She dips into foretelling the future when she tells Branjamar, within the year, death's awful spear will strike Queen Imogen, and Branjamar, now the loveliest by far, will be our new queen. A super happy Branjamar and her man-cat leave happy as can be. Eventually, the witch's prophecy would unfortunately come true. I wasn't the only person who seemed taken aback by the heavy-handed exposition and intertitles. The fairest silent film website in the land, Movies Silently, talks about that exact thing. Their article reads, like other silent films based on popular stage properties, the filmmaker seemed hesitant to cut down on the dialogue. As a result, there are a lot of title cards in the film, far more than was usual for films of the period. This is an issue since the film is so short and the story so well known that the cards really start to be an annoyance for a while. Now, we fast forward in the film quite a few years into the future and find ourselves in the heart of the royal court. Young lady dancers all dancing around a fountain as they play with, I guess, balls. They twirl around, throwing those said balls up in the air. Just a warning, the greatest or worst named character ever is about to be introduced to us. And that, of course, would be Sir Dandy Pratt Bombus, the court chamberlain. He comes out looking a hell of a lot like Stephen Fry with the weirdest, and for lack of a better word, erect outfit on. He introduces the dancing girls to their newest ball-tossing compatriot. Ladies, since Lady Cecily was sent home with the mumps, I have brought another young lady to take her vacant place. How very helpful of Dandy Pratt, and to be honest, I never much cared for Lady Cecily, so good riddance, Cecily. The new girl wastes no time getting the scoop on the princess. The other girls oblige and bring her and us up to speed, saying, first, Queen Branjamar isn't Snow White's real mother. When Snow White's mother died, the king married Branjamar. Another girl continues, after the king died, she grew awfully jealous of Snow White. She took away all of Snow White's princessy clothes, made her sweep and dust the palace, and now Snow White is almost like a kitchen maid. That revelation takes us to the kitchen where Dandy Pratt Bombus is checking in on the status of dinner and Snow White. She is cleaning a huge pot when the Stephen Fry look-alike tells her, "The new maid of honor has arrived, your highness." "Will you bring her to meet me?" Snow White asks. And this is our first true glimpse of the star of the show, Marguerite Clark. At this point in her life, Clark was a 33-year-old. She was a pro at portraying characters half her age or younger, and she totally would have been a breakout star on Beverly Hills 90210-like show in the 20s. Let's look at a little bit of the direction of this film via the National Film Preservation website. In an article about this film, we read, director J. Searle Dawley, a collaborator with Edwin S. Porter back to 1907, employs a static camera that moves only to introduce Marguerite Clark as she emerges from a barrel in the royal kitchen. Now, before Snow White can have too much fun, her stepmom arrives and orders her to be put to more work. This terribly disappoints Snow White, who returns to scrubbing the pot. Back upstairs, Dandy Pratt and his erect outfit tells the girls the princess will see them now. The group heads down, where Lady Astelin, the new girl, introduces herself to Snow. Astelin bows and kisses the hand of her princess. With introductions out of the way, they all cozy up and chat. Next, we're going to turn our attention to Prince Florimond from the nearby kingdom of Caledon, who is out on the hunt. Florimond is played by Creighton Hale, whom we just talked about in our previous episode, where we looked at Beverly of Graustark. Snow White now is back to work. She is asked by the kitchen crew to go fetch some ducks for the luncheon. She will be picking up 3 of them from the huntsman. She is excited about the task and runs barefoot through the woods and on sharp-looking dirt roads. As an actress, Marguerite Clark does this like she's running on pillows. Truly, some amazing acting chops on the lady. I was wincing in pain as I watched her zip around on the outdoor terrain in her fair bare feet. Whilst she is running on dangerously jagged ground, we are introduced to the huntsman's 3 children, Tina, Trina, and Tip, the first 2 being girls, while Tip is the lone boy. They welcome Snow White in with hugs and kisses. This commotion brings out Berthold the huntsman. She tells him she is there for the ducks, which he quickly rounds up. This is where Snow White and Florimond come into contact with each other for the first time. You see, Florimond is out hunting while Snow White teaches the children why you shouldn't cage little birds, which the children had done. They all happily let the brown bird out of the cage and watch it fly out the window. The only problem is it lands on a branch right in front of the previously hunting Florimond. Snow White cries out to Florimond as he is about to shoot the newly free bird. She tells him they just set it free, thus he cannot shoot it. He obliges the pretty girl and the children. They all bring the prince back to the huntsman's house where they chat a bit. The prince and princess spend some good time alone together before the children run back in. Florimond asks one of them what Snow White's name is, but she shushes the girl. The huntsman returns with the 3 alive for now ducks. Snow and Florimond walk together with the ducks before their paths must invariably split. "Will I see you again, fair one?" he asks her. "Perhaps," she coyly replies. Some time passes, and we are back in the castle, Dancing maids are dancing around as the cooks prepare what we can only assume are those cute ducks from earlier. While all this high-energy stuff is going on, Snow White is sitting, looking quite unhappy. The dancing girls run into the kitchen, which perks Snow White up. They want some dancing lessons from Snow White, dancing girl extraordinaire. She tries, but silent Stephen Fry orders her back to the kitchen. They all go to a side room away from Dandy Pratt, possibly to conspire and come up with a way around the Dandy Man. All while this is going on, Dandy Pratt is spending time with the Queen. She sees that Prince Florimond approaches. Dandy Pratt Bombus does his best to look important and usher in and announce the arrival of His Highness Prince Florimond, heir apparent to the Kingdom of Caledon, not the Kingdom of Graustark as we are used to with Creighton Hale roles. Snow White really wants to see the prince up close, but unfortunately, she is dressed like a maid. Not even as good as a maid. To their credit, the girls want to help Snow see the prince. Each girl lends her a piece of clothing to disguise herself as a royal maiden. They do good work. She looks like a bride, and she's perfectly sweet. All silver and white from her head to her feet, we're told. Oh, and about those feet. The outfit isn't complete, as she needs some nice kicks to finish off the ensemble, but there are not enough shoes to continue the charade. So, with some quick thinking, all of the girls take off their shoes so no one will notice that Snow White is sans shoes. And with that, they all enter the throne room and dance their little hearts out for the prince. He only has eyes for Snow White, though, but he doesn't realize it yet as she has a veil covering her face. Florimond steps in and asks for a dance. The two dance, eventually leading him to ask her to uncover her face. Yes, if secret it may be, secret between you and me, she replies. She does the veil removal, and Florimond is floored when he realizes that this is, in his mind, the servant girl whom he only recently met and caught feelings for. She is whisked away, however, as the queen is introduced and makes her way to the throne. Florimond pays her the respect her station requires, all while still thinking of her. He hands a proclamation to the queen. It reads, "From His Supreme Majesty, the King of Caledon, it is our wish that Prince Florimond be married to his cousin, the Princess Snow White. Signed, Caledonius Rex." Now we have a problem. Aside from marrying cousins, of course, that is what it is. It's a royal thing, I suppose. But Florimond doesn't know the servant girl he pines for is really Princess Snow White. Snow White? Well, as a little boy, I always dreamed of marrying my cousin, but you see, I've fallen in love with someone else, he explains to the queen. Branjamar, thinking he is talking about her, replies, "Oh, my poor boy, really? I'm so much older than you." "Oh, not your majesty," the prince fires back. "She is one of Snow White's maids of honor." This makes Branjamar all kinds of upset and demands all the maids be brought before her. Dandy Pratt rounds them all up, except, of course, Snow White, who has returned to her original look and stays hidden by the OG maids of honor. They stand before Florimond, but he doesn't see his girl until Snow White runs out. Since we are watching the characters talk about ages, how about some fun facts about the two stars of this film, Marguerite Clark and Dorothy Cumming, who played the evil queen. Cumming, despite playing a stepmother and telling Florimond how much older she was actually 11 years younger than the childlike Clark at the time of filming. Cumming was about 22 years old to Clark's 33. That's a real testament to their acting chops, since it wasn't until numerous viewings that I found out this age bit, and my mind was completely blown. Just looking at how they acted, moved, and generally carried themselves, I originally thought things were quite the opposite. Now, at this point in the film, and a few others sprinkled throughout, they seem to have harsh cuts. This more than likely would point to some missing scenes. Later in the episode, we'll get into the wild story of this film's survival, but here's a little preview that explains some of these missing scenes. According to the National Film Preservation Foundation, a few of the original sequences do not survive or may have been cut for European release, including the infant Snow White's delivery by a stork, a special effect praised in reviews. Back to the film, Florimond is in love. Branjamar doesn't want this union and tells Florimond, Wait until 1 year and 1 day hence, and then you may be married. I'm sending her away to a boarding school for backward princesses." The prince kneels and kisses Snow White's hand. "Farewell, Snow White. I will wait my whole life for you." And with that, a sad Florimond turns and walks away. As he leaves, Snow White says goodbye for a year and a day. Branjamar really makes things worse by telling Snow White to go and make ready for her journey. After this high drama situation, the wicked stepmother needs a little alone time, which I can't blame her for. I can't tell you how many times I've forcefully sent my stepchildren of royal lineage off to boarding school so I can have some me time and chat with my cats about who really is the fairest of them all. Actually, now that I think about it, that has never happened. I think that means I've watched this movie too many times. Regardless, though, Branjamar heads back to her room for a conversation with her mirror. "Mirror, mirror in my hand, who's the fairest in the land?" she asks. The mirror, really feeling himself, replies, "You who hold me in your hand, you were the fairest in the land. But today I tell you true, Snow White is more fair than you." And it ends with an exclamation mark. The mirror really puts some stank on that declaration, and needless to say, old Brangy is not at all happy with that answer. To make things worse, the witch appears in a plume of smoke seeking the heart of Snow White. Branjamar stalls for time and tells the witch she will have the heart by the evening. The witch agrees and flies off on her broom, which we get to see with a very clever animation of a witch flying through the night sky to her forest lair. Now, this cinematic adaptation carries over the big thematic elements of the original Snow White narrative. Let's turn back to Adam Gidwitz for another look back at the source material, where Gidwitz writes, "Snow White tells a different emotional tale. This is a story of competition. The stepmother loves her daughter until the girl threatens her position as the most beautiful in the land. Then the queen not only wants to kill her, but to eat her organs, as if ingesting her will allow the woman to take on the little girl's beauty." Back to the movie, the queen now summons the huntsman to her private chambers, and speaking of a little bit of cannibalism, she has a proposition for him. She tells him to go to the forest, kill Snow White, and bring back her heart. If he fails to comply, she will lock his children in the Grey Tower and starve them to death. She's quite a shrewd deal-maker, and he pleads with God for forgiveness before agreeing to her terms. As this goes on, Snow White says her goodbyes before leaving the castle. "Goodbye, dear ladies and gentlemen who have all been so good to me. I kiss you all," she tells them as she makes what could possibly be her final exit. All the while, Branjamar watches on as she leaves with the huntsman. We are now deep in the woods and see the return of the brown bird from earlier. As the huntsman stops to rest, Snow White spots the bird. "He seems to be trying to get me to follow him," she concludes. Berthold the huntsman is sick to his stomach with what he agreed to do to Snow White. What with the murdering and heart-cutting out stuff, and he can't keep up this charade anymore. "Oh, say you forgive me, princess. The queen has commanded me to kill you." The girl thinks the burly man is having a laugh, but he assures her of the terrible truth. Snow White doesn't think he has it in him to go through with it. He is too good of a man, after all. To prove this, he comes up with a plan. He is going to bring the queen the heart of a beast while he lets Snow go. And with that, the two say their emotional goodbyes and part ways. One topic we don't talk much about here is that of cannibalism. It's a fairly regular occurrence in the world of the Grimm's fairy tales, so let's see how it is handled in Snow White. I'll read this segment of the fairy tale for comparison purposes. The Grimms write, "As a young boar that just came running by, the huntsman stabbed it and cut out its heart and took it to the queen as proof the child was dead. The cook had to salt this, and the wicked queen ate it and thought she had eaten the heart of Snow White." Sounds tasty, right? No spoilers, but this film kind of handles the vital organ situation a bit differently, and we will get there, but it's pretty crazy how gory and messed up some of these fairy tales really are at the end of the day. Let's go from that to the magical film world again, as we see the two have gone their separate ways. Snow White is sad, and understandably so, having been left out in the woods to fend for herself. It doesn't help that she is being stalked by a lion. You know, those forest-dwelling lions. With things looking their absolute worst, she is reunited with her bird friend, who leads her to a cottage tucked away in the woods. She looks inside and sees a fully lived-in house. just with furniture for people of smaller stature. She is relieved to be safe and proceeds to make herself at home. She starts by having some of the food that is on the table. If I only take a little bit from each plate, I'm sure they couldn't be angry, she rationalizes things to herself. Lest you think she is some mooch, though, and food thief, she picks up a broom and starts sweeping. I'd like to do something to pay for my supper, she says. She works hard for supper before eventually falling asleep in one of the dwarven beds. This is a scene that sticks actually pretty close to the source material. It basically is an exact book-to-screen scene. The sets in this film also are top-notch. The dwarven cottage is especially magical here. They did a fantastic job of making so much of this fairy tale story believable. Even the witch's forest lair and the royal palace and throne room all looked phenomenal. A lot of work, money, or both went into this production, and it shows. At the very least, they reused previously used sets incredibly wisely. No matter how they did it, it worked, and it looks like $1 million. Next, we're introduced to the 7 small dwarves toiling away in the mines. It is soon evening, and their shift is over. Time to return to their house and have a nice big meal. This is where we get the dwarf roll call and learn all of their names, though they aren't the same names you're likely familiar with. In this film, they are Blick, Flick, Glick, Snick, Plick, Wick, and of course, Quee. Ladies and gentlemen, your 7 dwarves. Their haul for the day is pretty impressive. 100 weight of silver dust, 50 pounds of diamonds, and a bushel of rubies. Not shabby at all. After a moment of admiring their handiwork, they take their evening washing and sit down to eat. But something is amiss. They notice that some of the food and drink has gone missing. Someone must have eaten their food, they reason. They first think a robber is in the house, only to find Snow White asleep in Quee's bed. This gives us a few funny moments of the dwarves coming to the conclusion that she's a girl, and how they can get her to stay with them. Pretty silly stuff, but on brand for a fairy tale dwarf. Eventually, the girl wakes up and explains her situation to the 7 homeowners. I'm sorry, she tells them. I was so tired and hungry that I came in for a little food without asking, and I haven't any money. All I can do is say thank you and good night. They, however, won't hear of it and offer her place in the cottage. You may not want me here. My name is Snow White. This morning I was a princess. I am so sleepy. Please mayn't I tell you tomorrow morning? She asks them. They give her her space and let her go back to sleep before they soon follow suit. The general story of Snow White has been the inspiration for many an artist, and this cinematic retelling has also been at the heart of some great moments of creative inspiration on its own. One big one we hinted at earlier, but since we have an incredibly talented musician with us, let's talk about inspiration, Leslie. How did this film serve as an inspiration for your score?
So the 1916 film of Snow White is actually taken from the Broadway play. It was very successful on Broadway for a number of years before the writer-director Winthrop Ames had the opportunity to make a Hollywood film out of it, and brought along his star, the very charming Marguerite Clark, going from stage to screen, as still happens in contemporary movie making. There are just some beautiful set pieces in the Snow White film, from the fairy tale forest and the dwarves' charming little cottage with its heart-shaped windows, and certainly the set design in the royal court scenes are very, very fun to see, because they're quite elaborate and busy, and of course the film is black and white, or tinted in some places, but it's not a full color film. So I think all those elaborate patterns are a wonderful way to really make things pop. So Snow White is, of course, a very famous fairy tale from the Brothers Grimm, and with that, it has all the elements of the best of fairy tales, from romance to drama, to conflict, to a little tragedy, and then, of course, joy and triumph at the end, because happily ever after. Thank you very much. So certainly all those wonderful classic elements of a fairy story are inspiration for my writing for the harp and for the viola. This is the first time, this score is the first time that I had written for harp and for the viola, which is the instrument my sister, Barbara McMichael, plays. And I chose to include the viola because I knew I could wrangle my viola sister's arm into playing along with me, and that she would give me good advice about things that her instrument could do and couldn't do.
That is all incredibly fascinating to hear, and actually brings a couple things to mind. First, in a story featuring some messed up family dynamics, I love hearing how you and your sister have combined musical forces for this film. And the second thing, now that you mention it, I never noticed the windows in the dwarf cottage. I will definitely be on the lookout for those in my next viewing. Turning back to the film, we move back to the throne room of old Branjamar, who is meeting with the returning huntsman. He has in his possession the heart of Snow White and presents it to the queen. Well, he claims it's the heart of her stepdaughter, at least. While she wants to believe the huntsman is on the up and up, she has a feeling he's a little bit untrustworthy, so she has him locked up and sent to the Grey Tower. This is the same dungeon where his children are all actually locked up already. It is morning, and we move ourselves to the lovely dwarven cottage as Snow White prepares the gang for a day in the mines. She has really taken to her role as a quasi-housewife to the diminutive miners. With the dwarves off to work, she does chores around the house and dreams of her Florimond. Her fawning over said Florimond is interrupted by her bird buddy, which leads to some playful dancing with butterflies. Let's step aside for a moment from the film breakdown and talk about our Snow White some more. There is a reason Marguerite Clark took her Snow White role from stage to screen. She is the perfect conduit to bring such a timeless character to life, regardless of the medium. You can definitely see a magical element in Clark and her performance. It's easy to see why she was so popular on stage and why that success translated to film. There's definitely an X factor there that really shows itself off great with her performances on screen. Marguerite Clark's successes, Movie Silently writes, were due to her instinctive grasp of film acting and a spirited charm that proved to be just what audiences of the teens wanted. She is a perfect Snow White, sweet but not cloying, spunky but not coarse, good-natured and good-humored. Her gestures are slightly exaggerated. This is a fantasy after all, but have a restrained elegance, especially compared to other stage imports like Fanny Ward. Back in the dungeons, the huntsman is reunited with his children, except it is through the bars of their cells. They try to embrace, just to hold a hand even, though the bars are too narrow and the window too high. Those bars are no match for the buff Berthold who bends them. He is visited by Snow White's bird friend who has string. This string allows the huntsman to eventually pull his children into his cell. The family celebrates their reunited status, only to have a guard come walking by the now empty cell. The quick-witted huntsman uses the string to steal the jail keys, and before you know it, they are not just reunited, but they're also free. Now, as we start to come up to the closing moments of the film, I thought we could discuss some favorite moments. I obviously have quite a few favorite moments in this film, but I was curious as to what scene or scenes really captured your imagination as a musician.
I really can't pick a favorite single scene from this film. It's very charming and endearing, and certainly holds your interest for the 62 minutes or so of its running. There's a wonderful character, Sir Danny Pratt, who parades around in a ridiculous wig and a fancy embroidered coat and bows in a foppish, silly way. He's wonderful comic relief. I enjoy the scene where Snow White realizes she doesn't have any shoes, and so all the ladies in waiting to support her, they too remove their shoes as they all process out to the dance floor. It's very darling. I adore the forest scene where when Snow White and her woodsmen are out and they're guided by a little bird, and that's a scene where I wrote music to be the little tweeting bird that was leading her along to the dwarf's cottage. That's just a lot of fun for both my sister violist and I to play together.
I really love seeing how your creative process comes together, especially in how you and your sister were able to take inspiration from something so seemingly mundane as a bird flying. That wave of creativity really can come from anywhere. Turning back to the film, we are in the lair of the witch hex. This is where we get our use of the girl's heart, though not for edible purposes. The queen has brought her the heart of Snow White, or so she at least thinks. Hex proceeds to prepare the internal organ with a little help from her anthro-cat's tail. The cat then pours the concoction over the bald head of the witch. Instead of getting the luscious locks of Marguerite Clark, she grows pigtails on her head. Literal pigtails. This is low-key disturbing. The tails look nasty and super creepy on her head, and the lack of high-def picture quality only makes them look more real and disturbing. I legit cannot look at this scene for very long. It is, in my personal case, the definition of nightmare fuel. Needless to say, Hex is perplexed and really quite unhappy. If these are pig's tails, then that was a pig's heart. This revelation leads to the queen to her mirror. Mirror, mirror, truly tell, where doth Princess Snow White dwell? The mirror replies, mid the ancient forest dells, with the 7 dwarfs she dwells. The angry witch gives some directions to the queen before storming off to her cauldron. The queen has an idea to make things right and kill Snow White. In the film, we are denied one murder attempt by the queen that we get in the written version. In the upcoming scene, the intertitles reference laces of all sorts as an item the old-looking queen is peddling. In the story, however, the evil disguised queen gives the laces to Snow White and laces her up so tight that the girl stops breathing and nearly dies, only to be saved by the dwarven contingent. In the book, it is the second murder attempt where the queen brings witchcraft into the equation. Transform me into a different-looking person altogether, then give me the means to dispose of Snow White that the dwarves cannot trace back to me. Honestly, all I can see in this scene are those pigtails, so disturbing. So let's move on so I can unpause the movie and get that off my screen. So at this point, the witch turns the queen into an old hag with a poisoned comb. Put this comb in Snow White's hair, she tells the second fairest lady. Let it stay there while you count to 100, and all's over with her. Seems simple enough. The queen takes her wares to do some door-to-door sales in the dwarves' neighborhood. Actually, just at their place. How this deadly comb venture plays out on film is another example of the film sticking pretty close to the source material. We return to the happy-go-lucky Snow White hanging out and living her best life at the cottage whilst the dwarves mine away. This is when old hag queen rolls up offering a comb to the beautiful Snow White. The naive girl takes the comb offered to her after some hardball sales tactics. And with that, the hag/queen stabs it into the girl's hair and begins counting to 100. The poison starts to take effect as Snow White stumbles around the house before falling to the ground. The queen started counting, but luckily there were witnesses. The little brown bird told all this to a rabbit, and the rabbit went into the mines and told the 7 dwarfs, who raced up and intervened before the queen could hit the deadly 100 mark. Snow White was saved this day. Having felt the sting of failure yet again, the queen returns to her dark cell, changes her appearance to that of a pie man, and next came to the dwarf's house with a poisoned apple. Here's a beautiful apple I picked for my pies. Taste and we'll compare opinions. You eat the red half and I'll eat the white, she explains to the girl. On a personal note, I have never heard of a pie man, but I do love the idea of someone going door to door offering pies. There are few foods in this world I like more than pie, so I don't know if pie man was a legit medieval occupation, but I am all for it, and probably would die of poisoning if a pie man actually came to my door. So, I'll try to learn from this. Before we whistle while we work into the grand finale of this film, let's look at Florimond's literary counterpart and how he brings the beautiful Snow White back to life. Needless to say, it's way creepier than many film versions would have you believe. And some of the film versions can be pretty creepy. While most versions of this story rely on a handsome prince to be involved throughout the film's events, his role in the written story is very diminished and super disturbing in the fairy tale. So, after Snow eats the infamous apple and quote-unquote dies, we see the poor girl become a piece of furniture for the prince. Before that, however, the dwarves find her dead, encase her in a glass coffin, and keep her on display in the woods. The prince, in his first appearance in the story, stays with the dwarves while traveling. He sees the dead girl in a glass coffin, and like anyone would, I suppose, falls in love with her. He pleads with the miners to have her. He will pay any price, but they refuse. The Grimms write, "Then he said, 'Let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and prize her as my dearest possession.' As he spoke in this way, the good dwarfs took pity upon him and gave him the coffin." There is really quite a bit to unpack there, but we'll leave it since this is a long episode already. Needless to say, there is a lot about that paragraph that is incredibly suspect and really shows you how much these original versions of the stories change before they hit our eyes in popular culture. Oh yeah, how did the literary Snow White come back to life? That is a good story, actually. The unnamed prince's assistants are carrying the glass coffin but accidentally drop it. The jostling of the impact unwedges the piece of apple from Snow White's throat, and she comes to. So it wasn't magic after all, just poor chewing on the part of Snow White, apparently. Either way, she is now alive, and the two fall in love and get married. Which brings us to the actual conclusion of the Grimm brothers' fairy tale. Now, I will say the ending of this book version is pretty wild and really comes out of nowhere. So, Snow White and her creepy prince are about to be wed. The evil queen is invited to the marriage. It's pomp, it's circumstance, it's great splendor, all befitting a queen, right? After getting dressed up, she asks the mirror one last question. Looking glass on the wall, whom in this land is the fairest of all? The mirror answers, O queen of all here, the fairest is you, but the young queen is fairer by far, it's true. And with that, let's turn back to those Grimm boys to take us through the final crazy paragraph of the story. The Grimms write, "At that, the wicked woman uttered a curse, and she was filled with fear, such fear that she didn't know what to do with herself. At first, she didn't want to go to the wedding at all, but that gave her no peace. She had to go and see the young queen, and when she entered, she recognized Snow White, and she stood there in fear and terror, unable to stir. But iron slippers had already been set over fire of coals, and they were carried in with tongs and placed before her. Then she was forced to put her feet into the red-hot shoes and dance until she fell to the ground dead." I bet you didn't have molten hot slippers and dancing to death as the final humiliation for the queen and the final sentence of the story, right? But we are not just here to see how the short story ended. We have a fantastic movie to chat about that is reaching its own fairy tale ending. So, rewinding a bit, Snow White has eaten of the apple and drops dead, only to again be discovered by the dwarves. They believe there is no hope. Their beloved Snow White is dead. They cry and mourn the loss. It's a new day, and the huntsman and his children have gone to Florimond's kingdom, seeking help from the prince. Meanwhile, the dwarves keep vigil in the woods, guarding the princess's body. Their sad existence is interrupted by a procession led by Prince Florimond and the huntsman. It is a huge procession, actually. They approach the dwarves and their dead friend. Prince Florimond does what anyone would do in the situation and packs the girl up, sort of like the original story, but instead of dropping her, her corporeal form is returned to the castle where she grew up. Needless to say, the queen is not happy about this turn of events. Florimond tells the queen, "Last night I found her dead, and you did the deed." As the queen assesses the situation, Snow White spits out the apple and returns to life. This enrages the evil queen, so much so that when the queen breaks the magic mirror, and her evil face shows itself, and the witch finally received the hair she always wanted. The witch is wildly happy to have long, luscious locks, and the queen, I guess, is made to look ugly or at least normal. That was a bit hard to see, picture quality and all. Regardless, she is cast out of the kingdom, feet intact, as the people pay homage to their little queen. The film ends with Snow White ascending to the throne as the dwarves look on. They bid her goodbye, but she will have none of that. No, no, you must stay with me, my brothers, always, always. And that is how the film ends. Now, one of the big moments from the film's big finale is Snow White becoming queen. To really put over the unexpected coronation, a crown magically appears on her head as the evil stepmother is banished. It was a really cool effect that added a little fairy tale sprinkled magic dust to the proceedings. J.B. Kaufman of silentfilm.org takes us through that magical moment. He writes, in an interview with the New York Telegraph at the time of the film's release, director Dawley praised cameraman H. Lyman Browning for his camera effects, singling out the trick effect near the film's end, in which a crown magically appears on Snow White's head. In the scene, the crown seems to appear gradually out of thin air, a cross dissolve created by fading out on Snow White, winding the film back in the camera, and fading in again with the crown in place. Theoretically, this shouldn't be a difficult procedure, and it's not the only such effect in the film. In this instance, Browning filmed it in long shot on a stage crowded with players. In order for the transition to appear seamless on screen, Marguerite Clark and all the players had to remain motionless while Browning faded out the first shot, stopped the camera, wound back the film, and then faded in on the second shot with the crown in place. It is the first time, so far as I know, said Dawley, that this double exposure trick has been employed with a whole stage full of people. Was this the fairest adaptation of them all, though? Any review of this film should start with the pretty princess herself, Marguerite Clark. You can see in her on-screen performance how deeply connected she was with the role. Having played the role on stage for so long, it could only make her cinematic portrayal that much deeper and nuanced. She is, in my mind, the definitive live-action Snow White, and pretty neck and neck with Adriana Castellotti's iteration in Disney's 1937 feature. Clark really embodies the role and brings an innocence and charm that won me over from that first appearance stuck in a big pot. You would never guess she was in her 30s during filming. With this being silent, you had to get so much from her physical performance to buy into her being so young and naive. And surprise, surprise, she nailed it. It's such a bummer that so much of her filmography is lost. She is a real talent who could, if this performance is to be believed, capable of so much. Now, the tale of Snow White is all about the interactions and playing off each other. One of my favorite things about Clark's performance was how she interacted with the world. I especially loved the first meeting between Snow and Creighton Hale's Prince Florimond. It was so insanely charming and flirty and fun, but incredibly subtle. Even her acting opposite the friendly brown bird had its fair share of charisma. I am firmly convinced that she could act opposite a log and she would still win viewers' hearts. We also have to give Winthrop Ames his flowers for expanding the base fairy tale and giving Marguerite Clark a deeper world to explore as an actress. As we talked about earlier, the original story leaves a little bit to be desired when it comes to fleshed out characters and emotional through lines. In this film iteration, and presumably the play before it, we get a lot of new Snow White lore that would become synonymous with the story. But the Grimm started, Ames was able to add his signature to the timeless story. The direction in this film, provided by J. Searle Dawley, is incredibly spot on as well. The story moves at a brisk pace and nothing really overstays its welcome. He did a really good job of infusing the film with directorial fairy dust, creating a film that puts the viewer in a magical world. From the sets to the tinting and the special effects, this is a pretty complete cinematic endeavor. If you couldn't tell already, I love this film. There really is so much going on with it to capture your imagination. This rendition really is the fairest of all live-action Snow Whites as of this recording. It really also evoked a long dormant memories for me of the television series Fairy Tale Theater in both look and personality, and that, I believe, is high praise in my book. Now, let's turn our attention to the professionals now. The San Francisco Chronicle, in its review, would note that this story should have been put into film version in 8 gorgeous and dazzling parts is one of the wonders of moviedom. The praise would continue in the New York Clipper magazine, where they write, "While this is a feature particularly suitable for children, Still, there is much that will interest and entertain an adult audience. There is subtle charm in the action, and director Dawley must be credited with having turned out a visualization of the pretty little fairy story, which has long been a literary classic that will pass muster before the most captious of critics. Marguerite Clark is Snow White. She gives a performance that may easily be termed faultless. In the matter of sets and exterior locations, Snow White is worthy of the highest commendation. The cast is also up to the mark. As a whole, a notable production. Unfortunately, when there's good, there is always bad. So, some reviewers consider this film a bit of a bad apple. In a complete opposing opinion to the Clipper Review in the December 29, 1916 edition of the industry trade paper Variety, we read, "The famous players billed this picture as a special Christmas holiday attraction. They should have added the line, as a special entertainment for children only, and they would have been doing something worthwhile. The picture is an adaptation of the fairy play in which Marguerite Clark appeared some years ago under the management of Winthrop Ames, but one cannot conceive the why-for of the favor that it achieved on the spoken stage if the screen version is anything like the stage version. How anyone could expect those possessing adult minds to sit through this feature is a mystery. At the Strand on Sunday of this week, a number of people who had arrived to see this feature got up and left the theater before it was entirely projected. As a special entertainment for children, the feature will do, but as a regular program feature, it won't do. You know what will do, though? This episode. It has been fun to put together. A lot of incredibly unexpected fun. This episode is the perfect example of why we love making this show so dang much. This show really is a living, breathing entity that goes wherever it deems necessary to tell the story of silent film. Every time we try to make a hard, set-in-stone schedule of what films and topics we'll cover, it is always blown up in short order. Whether through Wikipedia rabbit holes, unexpected live events, or just the YouTube algorithm, the universe always ends up making our schedule for us. And once we dive in fully, we go all in here at the home office, and our research always leads us into such fun and fascinating avenues. And it was our research and cold internet communication that led us to the incredibly talented Leslie McMichael. Now, Leslie, before we let you go, what do you think is the lasting appeal of this film?
I appreciate this version of Snow White because her character is can-do and plucky, and there's the romantic fairy tale aspect of it, but also things like she's kind to animals, and she's good to her friends and her chosen family, and I just think a happy ending, happily ever after in this case, is a wonderful, wonderful thing.
You are so right with this film having a lot of great lessons folks can leave the theater with. I mean, the film definitely has a happy ending that, literary-wise, a lot of Grimm's fairy tales didn't always have. And the fact that we even stumbled onto this film as a show the way we did is a testament to the universe being the ultimate film and fairy tale buff and fan of the show. When I sit down to work on a new episode, I legitimately have zero idea where the whole endeavor will end up. Sometimes the script starts with one film, and by the end, we've decided to completely change course and jump to another topic as new, more interesting information surfaces. As you scroll through our episode list, it may seem like we jump all over the place thematically. Trust us, the behind-the-scenes stories of our show is riddled with silent film ADD. But at the end of the day, we wouldn't want it any other way, I suppose. It's part of the Golden Silent Films podcast charm, I guess you could say. And much like the way we were unexpectedly struck by inspiration by this film, we are not alone. I guess you could pretty much sort of say that the Golden Silent Films podcast shares this rarefied air with another content creator you might be familiar with. Part of Snow White's appeal for audiences today is the role it played in later film history, J.B. Kaufman explains before continuing. At a special movie party presentation at Kansas City's huge convention hall in January of 1917, it made a powerful impression on a 15-year-old Walt Disney. 4 prints of the film were projected on a giant 4-sided screen suspended in the center of the hall, while an orchestra provided the musical accompaniment. Disney later cited the event as a factor in his selection of Snow White as the story for his first feature-length film. The two films seem at first to have nothing in common. The Paramount film abounds in supporting characters and subplots that wander far from both the Grimm and the Disney's telling. However, the alert viewer can spot visual motifs and ideas that may well have influenced young Walt. This 1916 picture was a pretty solid box office success. According to the previously mentioned New York Clipper, we read, "This picture played all of last week at the Strand, New York. Crowded houses at every performance testified to its drawing powers. Should attract new patrons to the picture theaters throughout the country." Despite the financial success, Snow White came dangerously close to not having its own fairy tale ending. Much like Snow White, this film was saved from death, but instead of True Love's kiss reviving the film, it was a joint operation of the National Film Preservation Foundation and the George Eastman House. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The years since the film was released in 1916 have been a wild ride for this film. J.B. Kaufman sets the scene when he writes, "Snow White disappeared from view after that first round of exhibitions in 1916 and 17, and neither Disney nor anyone else saw it again for decades afterward. It was reportedly the victim of a vault fire that destroyed the negatives of all Marguerite Clark's Paramount films. Moreover, by the time of the fire, practically no prints of her film seem to have survived. In one fell swoop, the film career of this lovely actress was virtually erased from history." Years afterward, film historians Edward Wagenknecht and DeWitt Bodine wrote lyrically of Clark's sparkling screen presence in those lost films. Wagenknecht declaring that not having seen her was like saying, "You have never seen a silver birch or a daffodil." For several generations, their written accounts remained the only tantalizing reminders of the loss. But all was not lost. Kaufman continues, "Then in 1992, a tinted nitrate release print of Snow White with Dutch titles turned up in Amsterdam. A few scenes, notably the delivery of the infant Snow White to her parents by a comical stork, were missing, but the story was substantially complete and the picture quality was excellent. The print was returned to the United States and, with the support of the National Film Preservation Foundation, restored at George Eastman House. Thanks to their efforts, we can join the young Walt Disney and the rest of a generation of 1916/17 moviegoers in discovering this charming reclaimed chapter of film history." Now, when you look at film preservation, you might only think of picture quality. People don't always realize how many other components of the film need some tender love and care. And in this case, the intertitles were in need of some translating. When the film was found, it only existed with Dutch intertitles, and doing a simple translation wasn't all that was required, though it had to also be put into the aesthetics of the words being translated. The National Film Preservation Foundation walks us through the intertitle work, writing, "The George Eastman Museum recreated the lost original intertitles by translating the Dutch back into English, drawing phrasing from Winthrop Ames' play script, and duplicating the fonts used by famous players in this period. The complex 1998 restoration was made possible by funding from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Eastman House Council, and, interestingly enough, Isabella Rossellini." We now transition from a film that found new life to an actress who would unfortunately meet death. To do that, it is time to find out where your favorite silent stars are laid to rest. This is the segment where we join the fairest princesses of them all on the other side of the cemetery gates. The history, the art, the celebrity spectacle converge in Where Are They Now? Your guide to paying your respects to the actresses that have entertained us so much. This trip will focus on the latter years of Marguerite Clark as her film career wound down. Snow White was released in 1916, and Clark would be out of the film world by 1921. Remember when we talked earlier about her marriage to Harry Palmerston Williams? Let's let Amy Pavey tell us about those final professional years of the actress. Pavey writes, "When her 6-year Famous Players contract expired, she formed her own production company under First National Pictures. The company's first film, Scrambled Wives, 1921, turned out to be her last. She had planned to make a film or two each year, but after marrying Louisiana plantation owner and aviation entrepreneur Harry Palmerston Williams, she never performed again. There comes a point when you can go no further, and even if you have gone a long way, life is empty without love. But there are no limits to happiness when you are married to the man you love, she would say. The National Film Preservation Foundation adds, by her retirement from films in 1921, she surpassed even Mary Pickford in popularity as an adult actress playing characters half her age. That marriage would end under the most tragic of circumstances, however. Williams, who was co-owner of Weddell Williams Air Service Corporation, perished on May 19, 1936 in an aircraft crash. Weddell Williams Air Service Corporation was a big name in those early years of air travel, dealing in commercial flights as well as plane racing. The loss of Williams, along with the recent deaths in air crashes of both Weddell brothers, who had co-founded the company, along with the company test pilot, led Marguerite Clark Williams to sell the assets of the company in 1937 to Eastern Airlines. The new owner, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, folded the Weddell Williams Air Service Corporation into the larger airline operation, gaining the coveted mail route from New Orleans to Houston, giving Eastern its first presence in Texas. The sisterly bond between Marguerite and her older sister Cora would come into play once again. After the death of her husband, she moved to New York City, where she lived with her sister Cora. On September 20th, 1940, she entered Leroy Sanitarium, where she died 5 days later of pneumonia. A private funeral was held at Frank E. Campbell Funeral Home on September 28th. The actress was cremated and buried with her husband in Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans. Though she's not the biggest name in film all these years later, she does have the distinct honor of being awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. You can pay your respects to Marguerite Clark by stopping by 6304 Hollywood Boulevard. Photoplay magazine seems to have the perfect summation of the magic of Marguerite Clark when they write, all in all, she was just a charming, fascinatingly pretty girl whose charm, in such a strange, wayward, elusively, and delightfully feminine thing, that it can no more be set down in words than one can paint hummingbirds with a sign painter's brush. With us closing the book on Snow White, we want to thank you for spending your valuable fairy tale reenactment time with us. It's been so much fun seeing a story we all know and love so well told from the perspectives of some early silent film pioneers. Did you enjoy this tale of poison fruit and judgmental mirrors? What are your favorite fairy tales that have been turned into cinematic stories? Have you had an evil stepmother who conspired with witches in the woods? Are you an evil stepmother who has conspired with witches in the woods? Tell us your story. Let us know all those sordid details at the various social media spots of the Golden Silent Films podcast. We also would be remiss in our podcast duties if we didn't extend the biggest of thank yous to the wonderful Leslie McMichael for spending some time with us chatting about all things harps and fairy tales. It was amazing getting to know you, and we will definitely be following your harptacular adventures and hope to see you perform live in the near future. So, Leslie, please let everyone know where they can find out more about you and your live performances.
I'd like to highlight 2 upcoming performances in May. On Saturday, May 3rd, and then Sunday, May 4th. My sister, violist Barbara McMichael, and I will be performing my Snow White score for 2 New England shows. The first one is associated with the Ames Free Library, which is an 1880s era library built right next door to Queeset House, which is where the playwright Winthrop Ames, who wrote the Snow White play that later went on to become the film, which we are talking about today. So this is where he lived, and he's the famous son of Easton, Mass. So this live score film show will be occurring at Stonehill College, the Hemingway Theater at Stonehill College, that evening of Saturday, May 3rd. And I'm excited about that because this has been a long anticipated to arrange this performance right in Winthrop's stomping grounds. The next day we'll go to New Hampshire to the wonderful Park Theater in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, and play there. And that's a great vintage theater that shows films and also has performing arts. So that will be a 4:00 matinee, and it's always great to play at historic movie houses. Information about all my shows, my tour dates, and all kinds of things like that would be at my website, which is pluckmusic.net. Pluck like pluck the harp strings. And I also, at my website, you can find links to my YouTube channel where I like to have clips of silent film accompaniment, as well as some history snippets and other kind of harp composition and recordings that I have made. In addition to finding out about my tour schedule at my website, people can sign up for an email newsletter, which I send out, which will have details about that and other new musical projects that might be coming along. And I am always delighted to hear from other people who are as interested in film and music and history as I am.
That is all stuff I will be following ASAP, and it's wild how the universe works, isn't it? To cold email you out of the blue to talk about Snow White right before you play in the hometown of Winthrop Ames. That is super cool and almost a fairy tale ending of its own right for this episode. So speaking of historic towns with silent film ties, have you ever played here in Pittsburgh?
I have heard about the great silent film community in Pittsburgh and would love to know more. I haven't had the opportunity yet to play in Pittsburgh, but would welcome that. I know that there are a number of famous actors and actresses that hail from that part of the country, and think that's really cool. It would be really fun to score something with Olive Thomas and there's some other wonderful people as well. So count me in if there's a possibility in the near future.
It has been an incredible experience getting to talk to you about silent films and your career and your inspirations. I know I have learned a lot and can't wait to see and hear you perform in Pittsburgh, hopefully, fingers crossed, sometime soon, or at least catch you in a nearby concert hall in a nearby town. And I hope we can talk about some more silent movies soon.
Well, back at you, Stuart. Thank you very much for your time and interest. And I feel like I've met my people just talking here with you, and also having the chance to share with all the golden silent film people out there in radio land, podcast land, right? Thank you very much. It's been just a pleasure.
And on that note, if you have forgotten, we are on Instagram, Twitter, and now Bluesky. Let us know what you think of this episode. What silent and silent-related movies, past or present, do you want us to look at next? Our world of silent movie knowledge and experience is constantly expanding, and we need your input for our future episodes here and beyond. And there is one thing in particular we would love your feedback on. In an effort to keep this show fresh and switch things up a bit, we are always looking to add new types of content, and this episode, Snow White, serves as a backdoor pilot of sorts to one we have been thinking about for a while now. Since so much of the silent era was adaptations of books and novels, it seems only logical to do a series of episodes comparing classic silent films to their literary counterparts. Let us know if you want to hear our cinematic book reports on our socials and anywhere you can comment. Luckily, you won't need a mirror to find our social media hangouts. You can always find us at Golden Silence Cast on Instagram, at Golden Silence 1 on Twitter, and at Golden Silence Cast on Bluesky. And again, if you listen to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or any other podcast outlet that allows it, subscribe, rate, and review. If you're watching it on YouTube, like, subscribe, and comment. It does a lot for our visibility, and we love hearing your thoughts and ideas. We have set a goal of getting 100 subscribers during the year of 2025, so please subscribe and spread the word to others so other cool folks can be subscribed as well. We really, really, really appreciate all of your incredible support, and seeing how much you folks are listening on all of our many platforms only makes us want to make our episodes the fairest of them all. So, with that being said, thank you to all of you fine listeners for all of your fine listening. And don't forget, the silents are golden, and the talkies are just a fad. And don't eat the internal organs of your enemies, just to be safe. I am not sure at all where in this episode I could even fit this question in the episode proper, but there's one thing that's really bugging me. It's a weird harp-related question, but I had to know more. With all your travel and performances you were talking about, how does one travel with a harp? I have no real harp knowledge, but they seem big and heavy and pretty difficult to tote around. How do you do it?
So it's probably obvious that the harp does not fit in the overhead compartment of the airplane. When I first started doing this and had performances near enough to where I am based on the West Coast, I would just be able to put the harp in the travel van as normal and drive off to the theater, or hopefully a string of theaters, to do the live score performances. Many of my shows started happening on the East Coast, so what I would do in that case was I would try to book a string of shows, and then end up renting harps in each city, which got to be cumbersome and somewhat expensive. So I came to a point when I realized that I was doing this frequently enough that I should just locate one of my harps on the East Coast. And so in 2019, went down to California and had a wonderful show at the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum, and then traveled cross country through Nebraska, where I had another wonderful show, in another Fremont, and then ended up in New York. And I have a good friend from college who lives in the city, and the harp took up residence in her apartment. Please note the date, 2019. So my plan was to return the following spring in 2020 and start doing shows. And guess what? Guess what arrived in 2020? So the harp sat there in my dear friend's NYC apartment for a couple years, as all of us went through COVID, the pandemic shut down. And then I was there. It was waiting for me when we were all ready to resume normal life, and I started doing shows again in about 2022.